Okay, well, today's a different kind of day in that there's only a couple of us here. Hello. But also, too, the internet is down here on campus. Yeah. And so, what I've had to do to improvise is bring in my laptop with the saved PowerPoint on it and put it under the overhead projector. So this is improvisation at a time of technical failure is the best we can do. As I was telling her, what I'm going to do is just finish the last lecture. We only had a couple of slides left, but they're really important slides, so I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to, as soon as we're done, post a link to the film on Ida Wells. And you guys will just watch that. That includes you that are here and you that are not here. You guys will watch the film on Ida Wells at some point before the quiz on Thursday. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that work? You can get out of here.
I wasn't here last class though, so is the lecture that's on it on the?
Yeah, it's up. It should be. I say that. Did I put it up?
No, like you didn't announce it, but it's on there.
Okay. Okay. So it is in the course gallery. I just didn't make an announcement.
Yeah.
All right. I'll make a note to do that then. I appreciate it. So this will be weird for you coming in second half of the lecture that you haven't had, but it is on there, and I will as soon as we
So
get
I
out of
was
here.
like, one thing I was like, wow, he hasn't posted like the part 2, and I was like, and I went to your YouTube channel, and it's on there.
Oh, so it's on the YouTube. I haven't
You
posted.
just didn't announce it.
It's not in. Okay, I got it. I forgot in this class we're doing the YouTube thing instead of the Kaltura thing. All right. Thank you for letting me know, both of you. So this is where we were, correct? We talked about labor unions and stuff? Okay. So then this is where we were, and we've been talking about black folks who had decided to leave the South during Reconstruction or after Reconstruction or after the war, and how many had migrated to the West. A lot of black people, though, end up migrating out of the South and into the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. So from places like Boston and New York City to especially Philadelphia, as we'll see here in just a second, to cities like Chicago. And what they discover there is that discrimination was not only present in the South. Segregation was not only present in the South, and even disenfranchisement was not only present in the South. That they come to the realization that these are American problems. Discrimination against black people, including segregation of public accommodations and even disenfranchisement. Black activists who had been living in these cities all along were, of course, keenly aware of that. So if you were to leave the South and go to a place like Philadelphia, there might be people there like William Still and Harriet Tubman who could tell you, yes, we know it's been like this for some time. Tubman you may have heard of, and if you have, you are probably aware that she was an agent on the so-called Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad was not exactly an actual railroad. What it was a network of brave people, oftentimes armed people. I'd like to joke that Harriet Tubman was among the first gun-toting Republicans, because the Republican Party at that time was the party created to keep slavery from expanding. That is not what we want. Oh, come on, I can set that over and do that. Best part about this is I made a mistake of giving my friend a link to my YouTube channel, so now he's going to make fun of me for how awkward this all is. I wish the internet was down across all campuses so I too could mock him, but probably not so lucky. So Tubman was an agent on the Underground Railroad. In other words, she and people like William Still, they would shepherd escaped slaves into freedom and into some place where they could not be reclaimed by the Fugitive Slave Act and drugged back into slavery. So these were incredibly courageous people who continue that good work after the war is over and slavery is at an end. They become activists, taking particular aim at what we've just been talking about, segregation and disenfranchisement, or discrimination in general. Tubman and Still joined forces with a gentleman named Octavius Catto to attempt to desegregate the streetcars of the city of Philadelphia specifically. So streetcars were the public transportation of the day. I think that we talked briefly about before. And any city of decent size, including Atlanta, would have had a streetcar system to ferry people throughout the city and into the early suburbs, inner ring suburbs. And even in a place like Philadelphia, those were segregated. And so Tubman, Still, and Catto worked together to try to end that practice. So too in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, the streetcars were segregated. And here again we have an example of a longtime activist, an abolitionist, Sojourner Truth, who works to try to desegregate the streetcars of Washington, D.C. Sojourner Truth's story is an incredible one. She had been born a slave in New York, so her life itself is a reminder that there was a time when slavery was legal in more than just the South. Grows up in a family of Dutch heritage. You remember New York? Well, I'd say you remember. I don't know if we were talking about this in this class, but the colony, or the state we know as New York, was originally a Dutch colony, a New Netherland and New Amsterdam. But she eventually is sold a number of times and runs away at one point with her daughter, and then remarkably sues to get custody of her son. This is after New York state outlaws slavery, but still many slave owners tried to hold on to what slave property they did have. She was able, incredibly, to sue that person and to get custody of her son. At one point during the war, she is among those. Remember we talked about Frederick Douglass and recruiting for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry and other volunteer black units. She was among those that did that work. She worked to try to secure land redistribution like we talked about, how there were some efforts made at least to take land from Confederate slave owners in the South and to divide it up among slaves. That never happens, but Sojourner Truth was among those who tried to see that it did. And she was, of course, one of the most prominent abolitionists, advocating along with Frederick Douglass and others for the complete abolition of slavery long before the 13th Amendment becomes a reality. Catto is an interesting figure, too. He is sort of the preeminent city activist for black people in Philadelphia. I mentioned that he works with Tubman and Still to try to desegregate the streetcar system there. He's also a black educator, working to build black schools with black teachers, arguing that we don't necessarily want or need white teachers for black children. We feel like, in fact, we would be getting like the least qualified white teachers if that were the case. So why don't we just have our own black teachers teaching black students? This is a theme that would crop back up 100 years later nearly. And we'll talk about school desegregation in the South and throughout the country a little bit later on, but Catto a little bit ahead of his time in that regard. He eventually founds the city of Philadelphia's Institute for Colored Youth, of which he becomes the principal. And it's in that capacity that he's educator and social and political activist, and gotta make sure this is what's happening. He eventually begins to tackle the issue of disenfranchisement, voting rights. Because even in the state of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and other parts of the North, of the Midwest, or the West, black people could find it difficult, if not impossible, to vote. And that is something that Catto takes on as well, that eventually would cost him his life. prior to the 15th Amendment's ratification, remember it's the 15th Amendment that guarantees to black men the right to vote. Prior to its ratification, many states took action to prevent black voting, and I mean many states outside of the South. If you look at these maps here, the first one you're going to see states like Minnesota, Kansas, Ohio, Missouri, the state of New York. They all took specific action to ensure that black people could not vote. None of those are in the South. There was also violence where black people theoretically could vote, and as I just alluded to briefly, Caddo, on his way to the polls to exercise his right to vote, is murdered. Murdered for the simple act in the city of Philadelphia after the war for just going and trying to exercise his constitutional right to vote. And then if you look at the other map, you'll see states that rejected the 15th Amendment, including Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, and California. And there were states in addition to that that initially rejected it and only agreed to ratify it after they were assured that they could maintain their literacy tests and their property ownership requirements for voting. Two devices that would serve to disenfranchise potentially African Americans in those states. And think about the ones I just listed that are not in the South. Delaware, New Jersey, California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Talk about New England states. Earlier in the list of those states that took action to prevent black voting, we're talking about Midwestern states, Northeastern states, and even West Coast states. Now, I should make the point, if we're talking about, you see there, California and Oregon, this is not 100% about black people voting. Who might folks in California at this time be interested in disenfranchising?
Hispanics? Or is it Hispanic?
Close. Well, even before you have, and yes, you do have out there Latino people who had lived when that was part of Mexico that had been more or less taken over when America gets claim to that land. And so Hispanic people or Latino people, but I'm thinking especially in addition to that, and it's not fair to ask you this question because I haven't talked about it in here. But in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, there was a tremendous amount of immigration from East Asia. And so they're thinking especially of disenfranchising the Chinese in addition to Hispanics or Latinos. Does that make sense? And eventually the United States government would pass what they call the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would try to prevent immigration from China. America goes through these waves of anti-immigrant sentiment, and we are living in the middle of one, obviously. But throughout history, the target has been different, you know. At one point, it's the Irish. At one point, it's Germans. At one point, it's Eastern Europeans, and so on. And at this point, it happens to be the Chinese if you're living on the American West Coast. But most of this opposition centers around preventing black people from being able to vote. Now, whereas some black men did exercise their right to vote in places outside the South, black women could not. A challenge is laid down in federal court in which plaintiffs argue that the 15th Amendment ought to apply also to women, and the Supreme Court denies that in a famous case in 1875. The Supreme Court says no, the 15th Amendment does not apply to women, black or white. And so what you see is a reinvigoration of a women's suffrage movement aimed at securing for women the constitutional right to vote. And the leaders of this movement are probably names that are known to you, names like Susan B. Anthony, and names like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Lucy Stone. These three women joined forces with Frederick Douglass to form the American Equal Rights Association. But the American Equal Rights Association is a short-lived institution because those individuals, those key individuals, Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Frederick Douglass, who you already know about, could not agree on what issue should be tackled first, which issue is paramount. Now, if you were Frederick Douglass and Lucy Stone, the way to proceed was make sure the 14th and 15th Amendments are realities for black men, and then we can move on and press the issue of women's suffrage. For the others, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the issue of securing for women a constitutional amendment guaranteeing their right to vote was the paramount issue. Said, you already got your amendments, we need to focus on this first. And so a disagreement on sort of how to proceed or what should be the more immediate focus causes a split in the American Equal Rights Association, and you end up then with competing organizations. Sojourner Truth joins with Frederick Douglass and Lucy Stone to form the American Women's Suffrage Association, AWSA. That's Douglass, Stone, and Truth. This after Elizabeth Cady Stanton had formed her own National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA. That all make sense? Questions? So finally, then, I want to talk about Ida Wells. Someone that maybe you've not read a lot about or heard a lot about, and there are perhaps some reasons for that. The most obvious being, throughout history, the people that write it, and certainly those that select it for grade school children, they select these very uncontroversial figures that fit into this sort of happy narrative of progress that we've pretended like America has been experiencing in my lifetime and the lifetime before. Another reason is she runs afoul of, or she breaks with, there's a rift between her and other key black leaders that will sort of see her a little bit marginalized, if you will, even in her own time. Ida Wells was born a slave in Mississippi in 1862, so this is during the war. Her mother had been sold away from Virginia to Mississippi, and that is how she ended up there. Her mother sold away from Virginia, as so many were. And I don't know how much we talked about this in previous lectures, but by the time of the Civil War, tobacco was not nearly as lucrative as it had been in generations past, and a lot of slave owners end up moving into places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and so on, and becoming cotton farmers or sugar plantation farmers. And other owners simply sell their slaves, quote unquote, down the river to those places, to others who would become cotton or sugar planters. And Ida Wells' mother was one of those slaves. But it's 1862, meaning the war is over 3 years later, and with the 13th Amendment, they become free. Her father was the child of a slave mother and a white father, a tale too often to be told. He becomes a carpenter. After the war, he becomes a supporter, unsurprisingly, of the Republican Party. He is educated and becomes a trustee of one of the earliest HBCUs there in Mississippi, that is Rust College. Wells attended Rust College herself and decides she wants to become a teacher. And then her parents die. There was in 1878 an epidemic, a yellow fever epidemic, that takes regrettably both of her parents. And that leaves her and her grandmother to raise or to care for her siblings. Until, of course, her grandmother dies, and it is only up to her to raise those siblings. At this point, she moves to Memphis. If you guys don't know, and you're spared from me Google Earthing you because we have no internet. My buddy will like that when he eavesdrops upon this lecture. If you don't know, though, Memphis is in the southwestern corner of Tennessee and sits right on the border where Mississippi is here. So where the Mississippi Delta is, which is one of the great cotton growing regions, that's not far at all from the city of Memphis, Tennessee. And that is where Ida Wells eventually moves. in 1883. It was there she participated in her first act of civil disobedience. This is a key concept to which we will return time and time again in subsequent lectures. Civil disobedience, what does that mean? Yeah, breaking the law. Purposely breaking a law, so civil as in the law, disobedience as in breaking the law, purposely breaking the law in order to raise awareness. That's the key. In order to raise awareness because you feel like that law is unjust, or you feel like that law is immoral, or perhaps even plainly unconstitutional. And so you break that law in order to raise awareness of that fact, or simply to push back against the system that enacted that law. And Ida Wells' act of civil disobedience, 70 years before Rosa Parks, who refuses to give up her seat on a city bus in Montgomery, which is an act of civil disobedience we'll discuss. 70 years before that time, Ida Wells refuses to move to the smoking car of a train. She's on a first-class train to Mississippi, back to Mississippi from Memphis. And the way segregation on some of these trains worked is you're white, you get to sit in the first-class car. But if you're black, you got to go back to the smoking car. And she sits down in the first-class car and says, I'm not getting up to move. In this case, it takes 3 white men, including the conductor, to come back and physically remove her from the first-place car. And typically when we talk about civil disobedience, it is hand in hand with nonviolence, right? When we think about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, they're nonviolent. Ida Wells has a spin on that. She wasn't going to let herself be physically removed by 3 white men without fighting back. So she actually fights back too. So there's resistance here. I think she bites the conductor on the hand in the process of fighting back. And she sues the railroad company, and this would be another difference. Later when we talk about Rosa Parks, the Montgomery NAACP sues the city and the bus company, and they win. Well, Wells doesn't win here. This is not 1955 quite yet. We're still in the late 1870s, and Ida Wells loses her civil suit not once but twice. She does write about the incident, though, in a local Black Baptist newspaper, and that story gets reprinted widely, and this is the beginning of her journalistic career. She becomes a regular for the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper, black newspaper, eventually rising up to become part owner and editor of that paper. And then she becomes not just any journalist, but an investigative journalist. Someone who would set about systematically investigating something and then publishing a piece as an expose or bringing to light whatever it was she found in that investigation. She, of course, attacked Jim Crow, segregation in the South. She, of course, attacked disenfranchisement in the South. But most notably, she attacks and exposes lynching. Lynching was commonplace throughout the country, but especially throughout the South in this period. Lynching involved vigilante justice and extreme violence. In essence, you would have a mob take the law into its own hands and take some person, typically a black man in this period, accused of some crime, and rather than have them actually charged in the system formally with a crime, have them informed of that and put through a trial and a jury of their peers decides their fate or a judge. No, simply this is the mob grabbing this person up, condemning them as guilty and murdering them. Often by hanging, but also including all kinds of horrific violence before and after the hangings, public displays where townspeople, men, women, and children of all ages would come out and watch these murders, these hangings, as if it were some celebratory town affair. They would take tokens off of the dead bodies of these people, including not just things that they're wearing, but even appendages It is barbaric and disgusting, and regrettably not uncommon throughout the South in this time. And the most common charge or the excuse was, well, these black men are animals and they're raping white women. Ida Wells systematically investigates these lynchings over time and place and publishes an entire work, The Red Record, that shows that that was total bullshit. That was always a made-up excuse that played into stereotypes and the worldview of white men and perhaps women at the time too. And that in fact it was almost always that these were black men who had become successful. And white people didn't like it when these black men were successful and got uppity, as they would say. One of the first ones she covers was there was a black grocer whose grocery store becomes enormously successful. And they end up getting into a fist fight with a guy that owns the white grocery store nearest by. And the black guys get the best of the white guys. So not only you have the successful black person, but they beat up the white guys at their grocery store. And in response, they simply drag out the black guys at the black grocery store and murder them. And Wells writes about that. And then again, after a systematic analysis, said these are the kinds of incidents that almost always lead to lynchings. It's never actually a black man that's raped or threatened to rape a white woman. And she says, furthermore, if you look at slavery and its legacy, the reality is that it's black women that need protection from white men. It's the exact opposite. So this is her sort of master work, The Red Record, although of course it is not her only major work. But this is the one in which she demonstrates that White's rationale for lynching was simply false, and that indeed the opposite was true. You didn't have to tell Sojourner Truth that, and it's just an aside because I've included a little more information about her than in the previous semester. She had been, in fact, raped by one of her masters repeatedly and born a child as a result of that rape. Wells eventually leaves Memphis for Chicago. At one point she goes on a speaking tour of Britain, continuing to advocate throughout her life for civil rights and for also women's suffrage, and shining the light on Jim Crow disenfranchisement and lynching. She would be an inspiration for the next generation. I mentioned a rift that she had. We're going to talk about an individual named W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the leading black intellectual of his time in this generation we're about to talk about. We call it, your book calls it Freedom's First Generation, meaning the first generation of black people born after the war, not born into slavery. She'll be inspirational for that generation, but specifically with Du Bois, they don't see eye to eye on some things. Du Bois goes on to found the NAACP and rise to prominence as this great intellectual figurehead. Partly, I think, because of her falling out with him, she does not make her way as easily into our popular narrative of civil rights in America. But if we were here in an African American history class, it's absolutely essential that you understand her significance. But in any case, she's inspirational for that freedom's first generation, those people born after the 13th Amendment. And also, too, her work and their work will be foundational for building a civil rights movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that could then begin to at least attempt to systematically stand up to Jim Crow, to stand up to disenfranchisement, to stand up to lynching and extralegal violence, and so on. So you'll watch a film on Ida Wells that'll do a much better job than I did of outlining her life and career and character. I'll post a link here as soon as I go sit down in my office, along with a link to the previous part of this lecture. What else am I forgetting? Anything? Quiz 1 will be Thursday then, is that correct? So I'll probably post it late tomorrow night such that it will open at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning and then remain open all day Thursday and Friday. You only get one attempt, but it'll stay open so you can work around work schedule, sleep schedule, or whatever.
Do we have to come to class Thursday?
No. And then I should say that in my announcement, there will be no need on quiz day, to come in. Yeah. Other questions? All right, well, y'all have a good, rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.